The chill air of March 14, 1941 hung heavy over the tarmac at RAF Kenley. It was 7:42 in the morning. Beatrice Shilling, a dedicated engineer, stood silent, witnessing a Hurricane fighter pilot settle into the narrow confines of his cockpit for what could be his final patrol. At 32, with 6 years devoted to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, Shilling was haunted by a terrifying mechanical flaw that had become a greater threat to the lives of her pilots than the enemy itself. The records detailed a disastrous week of air combat. The Luftwaffe had committed 43 of its formidable Messerschmitt BF-109s to battle over the Channel. The resulting 27 engagements had extracted a horrific toll. 14 Hurricanes and 9 Spitfires were lost, each crash representing a painful loss of experienced aircrew. The sequence of catastrophe was tragically consistent. A British pilot would acquire a German target and immediately push into a high-G dive to gain speed for the attack. At the critical moment, the Merlin engine would falter, cutting power entirely. The German aircraft would then simply escape, or worse, the BF-109 would circle back to execute the paralyzed Hurricane, its pilot struggling desperately to restart the silent 12-cylinder engine. Shilling had meticulously reviewed every combat report, maintenance log, and interview with surviving airmen. The engineering truth was brutally simple. Under a sudden change to negative G-forces, the stomach-lurching push of a steep dive, the float chamber carburetor was flooded. The engine was starved of the correct fuel mixture, resulting in a complete power loss that lasted for a critical second and a half. A fleeting 1.5 seconds was all the time a Messerschmitt required to cover 300 yards of sky and open fire with deadly accuracy. This critical weakness was entirely foreign to the enemy. German Daimler-Benz engines utilized a sophisticated direct fuel injection system. Without a vulnerable float chamber, their BF-109s could execute radical, high-speed maneuvers, diving, climbing, or flying inverted, without a momentary loss of power. This granted them a profound, potentially war-winning tactical superiority in every aerial encounter. The RAF pilots knew it, the German pilots exploited it, and experienced flight crews were being bled dry faster than training units could replace them. Shilling had already invested 11 months wrestling with this fatal design issue. The engineering teams at Rolls-Royce were developing a comprehensive, long-term fix, a revolutionary pressurized carburetor. However, this complete fuel system overhaul was not projected for mass production until 1943, perhaps even 1944. The immediate demands of the air war could not wait for a perfect solution. Every dawn, young RAF pilots strapped themselves into their fighters, painfully aware that their own engineering might betray them before a shot was fired. Squadron Leader Davies, a veteran of 41 combat sorties with 3 confirmed kills, walked briskly past Shilling toward his waiting Hurricane. He was only 24. Twice in the last month, he had survived engine stalled during a diving attack purely by luck and instinct. He gave Shilling a brief nod. He was unaware she was the service's leading carburetor specialist from Farnborough, likely assuming her to be a clerk. Shilling's small leather satchel, slung over her Norton motorcycle, contained a secret. It was a small, precisely machined component of brass, deceptively simple. Her team at the RAE had tested it relentlessly on static engines for 6 weeks. It worked in the laboratory, but a bench test was not the 300-mile-per-hour negative G maelstrom of true combat. It was a gamble of life and death, decided in less than 2 seconds. She strode toward her motorcycle. Inside the satchel, alongside the brass restrictor, was a plan that would either secure the future of the Royal Air Force or abruptly terminate her engineering career. By the middle of the day, the answer would be clear. The root of the trouble traced back to July 1940, when the RAF upgraded to high-performance 100-octane fuel. The new fuel permitted increased boost, a vital leap from 1,100 to 1,330 horsepower, allowing the Spitfire Mark II to achieve speeds of 370 miles per hour and engage the swift Messerschmitt 109s. But the existing Skinner's Union carburetor was incapable of handling the extreme negative G-forces inherent in high-speed modern dogfighting. Beatrice Shilling understood the internal mechanics of a carburetor better than almost anyone in Britain. She arrived at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in November 1939, a month after the conflict erupted. As the principal technical officer in charge of carburetor R&D, she was one of only 2 women in the engine section. The other was a typist. Shilling was unconcerned with the prevailing skepticism regarding female engineers. Her sole focus was preserving the lives of the pilots. She was a lifelong mechanic, having stripped, studied, and rebuilt her first two-stroke Norton motorcycle engine at the age of 14. By 25, she had raced that Norton at Brooklands, maintaining a 106-mile-per-hour average and earning the prestigious British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star, only the second woman ever to do so. Racing taught her intimately how stressed engines failed during high G turns and rapid acceleration. This intuition had made her the best carburetor specialist available. In January, the solution materialized in a flash of elegant simplicity. If the float chamber flooded because fuel flowed unrestricted when gravity inverted, why not simply restrict that flow? Not entirely, but just enough to prevent the catastrophic surge. The engine would still receive sufficient fuel, but the excess would be curtailed. Her device was a small brass disc, a thimble-shaped restrictor with a meticulously calculated hole bored through its center. The crucial dimensions, a 0.04-inch aperture, were the result of 17 different tests. Too large, and the flooding continued. Too small, and the engine would starve at full power. She simplified the design to a flat, easily manufactured washer for rapid installation. Laboratory simulations confirmed the device stopped the fuel surge during negative G conditions, but Shilling needed a real-world trial. Securing formal approval for an unauthorized aircraft modification required navigating dozens of bureaucratic regulations. If the restrictor failed and cost a pilot his life, Shilling faced court-martial and disgrace. She decided to bypass the rules and seek forgiveness later. That morning at Kenley, she carried 6 finished restrictors. She also had the essential cooperation of Sergeant William Cooper, a ground crew chief. Cooper, who had personally witnessed 19 engine-related pilot fatalities over 3 years, asked no questions when Shilling presented the brass washer. He simply took his tools and nodded. The Hurricane, with Davies already in the cockpit and the engine warming, was 20 minutes from takeoff. Cooper worked with surgical speed, severing the fuel line connecting the pump and the carburetor. The restrictor was slid into place and secured with a small butane torch. The modification was completed in 60 seconds, rendered invisible beneath the cowling. Shilling inspected the flawless weld. Squadron leader Davies was flying into battle with an unauthorized change he knew nothing about. If the restrictor failed and Davies was lost, there would be no official record, no paperwork, just a dead pilot and a tiny brass washer that should never have been there. The Merlin engine roared to full power during the pre-flight checks. The Hurricane accelerated and climbed, banking south over the channel. Shilling watched, binoculars trained on the sky, as Davies and his section of 3 climbed toward 15,000 feet, heading for Dungeness, a known engagement zone. If a Messerschmitt appeared, Davies would dive, and the simple brass solution would either work or fail spectacularly. Shilling and Cooper stood motionless on the tarmac, the sounds of the active airfield fading into the background noise of her mental calculations. 40 minutes elapsed, then an hour. Radio silence persisted.
At 9:37, the control tower's radio suddenly crackled. 3 Hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. Shilling lifted the binoculars and saw them. 3 dark shapes against the sky. All 3 were present, no losses. Davies' aircraft touched down first, taxied to the dispersal pad, and cut its engine. Shilling approached, her hands trembling. Davies removed his helmet, and a wide, exhilarated smile broke through the fatigue, a rare sight for a pilot returning from combat. Sergeant Cooper spoke first. "Any trouble with the engine, sir?" Davies looked from Cooper to Shilling and back to the sergeant. "The Merlin's never run better," he announced. "I dove on 2 Messers over Dungeness. The engine never coughed." Shilling pressed him for the details. Davies explained that he had spotted the 2 Messerschmitts below and pushed his section into a violent dive, reaching 400 miles per hour. The negative G forces should have silenced his engine, but the Merlin ran at full, uninterrupted power. He closed to within 200 yards before the German pilots realized their danger. Davies fired a 3-second burst, scoring hits, and the German aircraft immediately fled toward the continent. It was his first successful, fully committed diving attack in nearly a year. He demanded to know what the ground crew had done. Shilling explained the restrictor, the small brass washer, and its function to limit fuel flow. Davies stared at her for a moment, then turned to Cooper. "I want that thing in every Hurricane on the station," he ordered, immediately. When Shilling mentioned the lack of official authorization, Davies dismissed the concern. After witnessing 19 engine-related deaths, he prioritized his squadron's survival over paperwork. That afternoon, Cooper installed restrictors in 4 more Hurricanes. Over the following 3 days, 5 Hurricanes with the modification flew patrols. They conducted 12 successful diving attacks against enemy aircraft, with 0 engine failures. The pilots reported flawless performance, with some even claiming a noticeable increase in power at altitude. Word of the miraculous fix spread like wildfire. By March 18th, every squadron commander in 11 Group was urgently calling Shilling. The problem became one of industrial supply. Shilling had machined the first 6 herself. Mass production required proper funding and factory contracts. Within 4 days, the Air Ministry fast-tracked her proposal, hailing it as a war-winning modification. Rolls-Royce received the manufacturing contract, aiming to produce 500 restrictors weekly. Shilling quickly assembled a small mobile team to oversee installation across Britain. She loaded her tools onto her Norton and set off, utilizing her intimate knowledge of the 43 RAF bases in southern England. On March 26th, she arrived at Biggin Hill, 11 Group's busiest fighter station. Station Commander Group Captain Grace, who had lost 7 pilots to engine failure in 2 months, demanded immediate action. The installation teams worked in 12-minute cycles per aircraft. Disconnect, weld, reconnect, check for leaks. The weld quality was paramount. A faulty one could starve the engine entirely. Shilling personally supervised every single fitting. Pilots watched with intense interest. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, a Cambridge engineering graduate, asked how such a simple washer could solve a complex problem. Shilling explained the physics of fuel flow and float chamber dynamics. Lacey simply called it brilliant simplicity. By March 28th, all 53 Merlin engines at Biggin Hill were modified. Shilling moved on, leaving behind a trail of operational fighters and a flawless safety record. The modification quickly acquired a nickname, allegedly coined by Rolls-Royce engineer Sir Stanley Hooker, Miss Shilling's Orifice. The crude, familiar humor of the military world was accepted by Shilling. If it helped the airmen remember the crucial modification, she didn't object. The nickname traveled faster than the parts. By April, some pilots were refusing combat duty until their aircraft received the fix. German intelligence soon registered the change. Luftwaffe after-action reports noted that British fighters were no longer breaking off attacks during negative G maneuvers. The decisive tactical advantage had vanished. By mid-April, Shilling's teams had installed restrictors on over 2,100 Merlin engines, every operational Spitfire and Hurricane in fighter command. The device became standard equipment. Though the proper pressure carburetor remained in development, the restrictor was a spectacular and necessary stopgap measure.
the meticulous combat statistics told the full story. Before the restrictor in March 1941, RAF fighters reported engine failures in 38% of all diving attacks. German pilots actively lured the British into the fatal dive. Following the April modifications, engine failures during diving attacks plummeted to an almost non-existent 0.4%. The kill-to-loss ratio improved dramatically. March had been a brutal exchange. 47 British fighters lost for 61 German aircraft destroyed, barely better than breaking even. April was fundamentally different. 29 British fighters lost, 94 German aircraft destroyed, a ratio of 3.2 to 1. Squadron commanders credited the restrictor as a major factor. Pilots like Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, who had suffered 4 failures before the modification, gained the confidence to commit to aggressive, winning tactics. The demand spread to Coastal Command, Bomber Command, and even the Fleet Air Arm. Restrictor production reached 1,000 units weekly. The long-awaited pressure carburetor arrived in January 1943, offering the perfect float chamber-free solution. However, converting an existing aircraft required 8 hours of intensive maintenance, time the RAF could not afford to ground its squadrons during ongoing combat. Consequently, many older aircraft retained Miss Shilling's orifice until 1944, some even to the end of the war. It was trusted, maintainable, and it worked. Shilling turned her attention to a new series of critical problems: cold weather starting systems for engines deployed to the brutal Russian front, and fuel mixture problems for fighters operating at extreme altitudes. She developed altitude-compensating carburetor changes that boosted the Merlin's performance by 8% above 30,000 feet. Keith Maddock, chief engineer at Hangar 42, later stated, "Beatrice Shilling helped us win World War II. Of that, there is no doubt." Her personal life remained compartmentalized from her urgent wartime work. Married to aerodynamicist George Naylor in 1938, she worried constantly as he volunteered for RAF Bomber Command, flying Avro Lancasters with 625 Squadron. With 1 in 2 bomber crew members failing to survive the war, her concern was justified. But Naylor completed his tours and returned to Farnborough in 1944. Shilling continued to find solace and clarity in racing and riding her Norton motorcycle, often reaching 90 miles per hour on country roads. Some of her most significant engineering breakthroughs emerged during these high-speed rides. By the armistice in May 1945, Shilling had contributed to 17 major war projects. She remained at Farnborough as the RAE shifted from wartime emergency to peacetime research. In 1948, her contributions were formally recognized when King George VI appointed her Officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE. She never achieved the top administrative positions, which remained reserved for men, but she preferred the hands-on environment of laboratory testing and real-world problem-solving anyway. Her later career included work on the Blue Streak missile program and researching wet runway braking effects, which saved pilots from fatal jet landing accidents in the 1950s. Shilling retired in 1969, having given 33 years of continuous service. She spent her retirement restoring vintage motorcycles, forever maintaining the Norton that had first taught her about engine stress. She died on November 18, 1990, at the age of 81. The obituaries universally highlighted the restrictor, Miss Shilling's orifice. Her complex post-war career became a mere footnote. Her legacy endures not only in physical tributes, museums, and university buildings bearing her name, but as a profound teaching example for engineers globally, a simple, elegant solution implemented under extreme duress, which achieved immediate, measurable, and life-saving results. The small brass washer remains a permanent reminder that brilliance does not always require complexity.